Hey, folks. Welcome back to World Politics. Um, this will be the third and final um, uh, lecture on realism. And you'll recall that where we dropped off, we talked about the notion um, that we can establish a balance between offense and defense and warfare, or imbalances, and that where the offense has the advantage, it's easy to take territory. That creates an intense security dilemma and increases the likelihood of war. It's easy to carry out aggression. But on the other hand, where the defense has the advantage, the offense would require lots more weapons and troops in order to overcome an entrenched defense. Well, in that case, aggression is very difficult, and the security dilemma loosens, and war becomes much less likely. Now, the interesting exception to this is nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons have very different impact than what we call conventional weapons, the kinds of weapons that were used in the world wars. Um, Contrary to conventional warfare, at the nuclear level, offense dominance discourages war as long as both sides have nuclear weapons and have the ability to strike first, to carry out as long as both sides have the ability to retaliate if they're attacked first. So this is called mutual assured destruction. Now, why do I say that this is different from conventional warfare? Well, in the case of conventional warfare, war becomes less likely, the incentives to war are lower if you have the ability to defend yourself, to stop the other side from breaching your border, for instance. You can protect your population that way. But with nuclear weapons, it's impossible to defend yourself once the weapons are actually launched. The weapons are launched on missiles, typically, although they can be delivered via bombers, but most often from either land-based or submarine-based missiles. Sometimes cruise missiles, which are launched from offshore by planes. But in any case, you have a missile coming in. Well, what that does is basically it jumps right over your border and allows the enemy to target your population directly. And there's no real way to defend against that. There used to be what we call civil defense, where the U.S. and Soviet Union both, the Soviets more than the U.S., thought, well, people can go into underground bunkers. Subway systems in Moscow were dug deep underground so that would be a place people could go if there were a nuclear war, and they could survive. In the United States in the 50s, many people built underground backyard bunkers or shelters where they stocked them with food and with water and generators and books and other things. They had beds down there and kitchens, and the idea was that if they're a nuclear weapon, your family would lock itself inside this underground bunker and wait it out until the radiation levels had fallen. That was never a very practical way to address the nuclear threat and would have been totally ineffective in protecting the population. Another way that's been tried is the development of anti-ballistic missiles. These are weapons designed to destroy an incoming missile. You either destroy it during its boost phase, shortly after it leaves the ground, or you destroy it in mid-flight, or you try to destroy it as it's approaching its target. In any of these cases, it's very, very difficult to, it's like hitting a bullet with a bullet. It's very difficult to target and destroy missile-laden nuclear weapons. And in fact, they're traveling so fast, and there were so many of them. At the height of the Cold War, both sides had about 12,000 missiles that could reach the other country, the U.S. and Soviet Union. They had additional weapons in the form of tactical or intermediate range weapons. But the intercontinental ballistic missiles were about 12,000 on each side. Way too many. Let's say that the Soviet Union launched 10,000 of those at the United States and just held back, some of it. Well, let's say we had a 99% effective defense, anti-ballistic missile defense, which is impossible. That's never going to happen. We never came anywhere close to that. But let's say we did. Well, if 10,000 weapons were launched, then 100 are still going to reach their targets. So 100 nuclear weapons, each of which is many times more powerful than the weapons that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. No way that's acceptable. If they just hit 50 of our cities, biggest cities, that's a level of destruction far exceeding even World War II. So you really can't defend yourself against nuclear weapons. The offense has almost an absolute advantage. So if defense doesn't work, what does? Why is it we haven't had lots of nuclear wars to this point? It's because while defense doesn't prevent war, deterrence does. Deterrence is the ability to threaten retaliation. So yes, you can't stop the other side from destroying your population if it wants to. You're vulnerable. There's nothing you can do about that. But the other side's also vulnerable. And what you need to do is not protect your population, protect your missiles. Put your missiles underground, put them on submarines, make sure that even if the other side does strike you with the first strike of nuclear weapons, that your missiles will be able to retaliate, that they'll survive. It's called having a second strike capability. Well, if each side knows that, yes, I can destroy my enemy, but my enemy will in turn be able to destroy me. It's called mutual suicide, mutual assured destruction. No one then has an incentive to start a nuclear war. Now, what's ironic and kind of counterintuitive about the nuclear balance is that even if you had the ability to carry out a successful first strike, and by a successful first strike it means you could in fact destroy all the other side's nuclear weapons, either sitting in their silos or you're somehow able to track their submarines. You could destroy all their nuclear weapons and ensure that they could never strike back. They had no ability to retaliate, no second strike forces. That would be a very, very dangerous thing to have. Because unless you are willing to use it, then what you're doing is putting the other side in what's called a use it or lose it situation. They have nuclear weapons, but their nuclear weapons cannot be used to deter an attack. Instead, the only possible use of those weapons is to try to strike first at the country that threatens you and at least destroy some of its nuclear forces. Even if that country has some nuclear forces survive and it does have the ability to retaliate, that ragged second strike won't be as dangerous as a full-fledged first strike. So your incentive, if your forces are vulnerable, if you know that you don't have a deterrent, is to strike first. Obviously, if I know my enemy now has an incentive to strike me first, that's not good for me. I don't want to give the other side any incentive to strike first. I don't want them to feel that the only way to even protect themselves partially is to attack me. I want them to feel very secure that I would never attack them because they have the ability to retaliate. So actually, each side is safer knowing that the other side has a second strike or retaliatory capacity. Imagine a world where neither side had a second strike capacity. Both sides had the ability to totally take out the other side's nuclear weapons in a first strike. Well, in that case, one or the other would be a hair trigger world. One or the other would inevitably use their nuclear weapons. So, at the nuclear level, the idea that defense is good and offense is bad becomes flipped around. Defense actually is bad because it tells the other side that you're trying to gain a first strike capability. And offense is good to the extent that it establishes a deterrent and makes it impossible for either side to contemplate victory in nuclear war. Now, one of the important things to know about how offense-defense affects the likelihood of war is that it's not so much the real balance between offense and defense as it is the perception of the balance between offense and defense. Because after all, the decision to go to war is taken before one actually tests the balance of offense and defense in warfare. You will have your own ideas, your own prediction about whether the offense or the defense will have an advantage in the coming war, but you can't be sure because you haven't fought the war yet, right? The only glimpse you have is based on you look at the most recent major war that under similar conditions to those that would obtain in the war that you're considering fighting. So the problem is that it's not uncommon for countries to misperceive the actual balance between offense and defense. We've already seen an example of this. Right? I talked about the case where in World War I, all sides thought it was going to be a quick offensive war. And whoever struck first, therefore, would have a big advantage. Whoever waited and held back on defense would be at a huge disadvantage because in 1870, the Prussians struck first, and their offense had been very effective in carrying out a quick victory over French forces. So there was this idea that the offense would have the advantage. Now, we know that that wasn't true. The defense had the advantage because, as I mentioned, the machine gun. And so because countries were overconfident that the offense would have the advantage, they were each eager to be the first ones to strike. Because of that, the political leaders were being pressured by the military leaders as the crisis deepened, the diplomatic crisis deepened, to cut short diplomacy that might have, averted the war, and instead to begin mobilizing their military forces so they could make sure that they were not that the other side didn't get in the first blow. Now, this misperception of offense dominance had other effects. First of all, it cut off diplomacy. But second, it also meant that countries carried out a policy of trying to line up alliances ahead of time because they knew that their own defense would not be enough to protect them if they were attacked. Therefore, they wanted to have allies already lined up solidly on their side so that together their alliance would be able to absorb an attack out of the blue if one were to take place. Therefore, there was something called chain ganging, where countries were rushing to line up allies, and therefore, if two countries from different alliances came into conflict and went to war, it pulled in all of the other countries who were allied with them. So small local wars that really didn't involve the actual states didn't involve other countries much, now grew to become big system-wide wars that involved all of the great powers. Nobody could afford to really sit it out. That was World War I. So the lesson of the war was that states should have allowed more time for diplomacy, and they should have resisted the urge to rush to the defense of weaker allies. Now let's look at how this took place. It's really quite fascinating. Here's Europe prior to World War I. Germany is a rising power. But Germany has a problem. As it rises, its neighbors become more nervous about its growing power. And they begin to form alliances against the rise of Germany. So that means first France and Russia form an alliance. And then finally, the United Kingdom or Great Britain also joins that alliance. It's something called the Triple Entente. Now Germany, despite its growing power, feels encircled. What does it do? It looks to really the only other great power that is in a position to help it, and that's Austria-Hungary. And so Austria-Hungary becomes a crucial ally for Germany, even though Austria-Hungary is not a very strong player at this point. It's big, but it's kind of a bit weak. Now, the other, so you had Italy was also part of what came to be called the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Although interestingly, Italy, once the war came, did not fulfill its alliance commitment. It actually it left Germany and Austria-Hungary out to dry. So you had the Triple Alliance, Triple Entente. That's the chain ganging, where countries are tying themselves to one another. Now, this idea of chain ganging, by the way, it's an analogy based on the old practice where prisoners would be sent out to dig ditches along the roadsides, and their ankles would be they'd be chained to one another by their ankles, so that if the one in front moved, it would jerk the one behind, which would jerk the one behind, which would jerk the one behind. So it would have a chain gang effect. The whole chain gang would end up moving. Now, so how did the war actually start, though? Well, there was another, besides Austria-Hungary, there was another empire that was weakening, and that was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was gradually finding that all of the small ethnic groups in the Balkans, the south east corner of Europe, that were part of the Ottoman Empire, began to agitate for independence. And they were often supported by bigger powers like Russia or Germany or Austria-Hungary, who wanted to gain influence in that region and to weaken and push back the Ottoman Empire. So as Germany and Russia in particular jockeyed for influence over the newly independent small countries that were emerging in the Balkans as the Ottoman Empire retreated, there were a series of crises where their small allies were pitted against one another. And finally, it came to a head in August 1914. What happened briefly is that the Austrian Empire became the Austrian-Hungarian Empire because the dominant German ethnic group was challenged by the next largest ethnic group, the Hungarians. And the only way to hold the empire together was to give the Hungarians some autonomy. And so they actually had a single emperor, but two kings. And the empire, therefore, became the dual monarchy system. But there were other groups. There were Poles, there were Albanians, there were Serbians, Romanians, Bulgarians, all of whom existed within Austria-Hungary, but who now wanted their own autonomy or even independence. But the emperor was wary of giving any more autonomy because he thought, well, having two groups, a dual monarchy is difficult enough. Having a triple monarchy, a quadruple or quintuple monarchy would be impossible. So they were determined not to give ground to any other ethnic groups that carried out separatist activities. But these ethnic groups were often agitated on and supported by the newly independent countries on the border of Austria-Hungary, one of which was Serbia. So Serbians within Austria-Hungary were being encouraged toward independence by Serbia itself. Now, an Austrian Archduke Ferdinand was killed by a Serbian nationalist. He was assassinated, and the assassin was tied to a group called the Black Hand, which was a Serbian nationalist group. The Austrians felt that this was a part of a campaign by Serbia to spark insurrection within Austria-Hungary, and so they decided to use this as an opportunity to assert their power and to put Serbia in its place and for once and for all try to tamp down nationalist pressures. Well, what they did is they gave Serbia a list of an ultimatum of 10 demands and said, you have to meet all 10 of these demands or we're going to declare war. Now, one reason that the Austrians were willing to do this, even though they knew Serbia was allied with Russia, and therefore war with Serbia would risk war with Russia, is that the Austrians knew that the Germans would come to their aid. And in fact, they had approached the German emperor, the Kaiser, who gave assurance that what's called the blank check, meaning if you have to go to war, we'll go to war with you. With that assurance, Austria-Hungary then confronted Serbia, issued the ultimatum, and when Serbia met 9 but not the 10th, one of the demands they held out on, then Austria-Hungary, wanting war to start with, went ahead and declared war on Serbia. Now, they hoped that because Germany had made a public declaration of backing Austria-Hungary, that Russia would be intimidated away from supporting Serbia. Turned out not to be the case. Russia did support Serbia. So now war was inevitable. It was going to be a war between, it could have been a war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, but each had lined up support from their great power patron, so to speak. And so it was likely to be a war that drew at least Germany and Russia in. But why France? Why Great Britain? Why eventually even the United States? Well, let's look at Germany. Germany faces enemies on two fronts, two sides. The problem then is if France and Russia were to attack a coordinated attack on two fronts against Germany, German army would be split between the two eastern and western fronts, which would be a great disadvantage. So, in the 1890s, a German general named Schlieffen developed what's called the Schlieffen Plan. And the idea was that Russia was an enormous empire. It had backward rail networks. And in order to mobilize for war, it had to bring troops across huge distances just to get them to the front lines. Well, in doing so, it would take so long that Germany would be able to mobilize much, much more quickly. So while Russia is taking months to mobilize, what Germany would do is take its full army and leave its eastern front vulnerable, take its army and attack France first. Germans believed that if it's just France against Germany, that Germany could defeat France quickly. Again, because they thought the offense had the advantage, so they could win a quick offensive strike against France. Once France is defeated, then they don't have to worry about their western front, so they could move their full army to meet the Russian challenge, and they could do all this before the Russians mobilized. By the time the Russians are ready to attack Germany, Germany would have its full army available to meet that attack. So this meant that this idea that Germany would have to attack France first before Russia meant that France was going to be pulled into the war. Now, actually, the Kaiser asked his generals, he said, we shouldn't have to fight France, let's just fight Russia. And they said, all of our military plans are based on the assumption of a two-front war with all of our army initially fighting France. And we can't change it. We can't change all of the railroad timetables and just fight Russia. And even if we did try to do that, we'd leave ourselves so vulnerable on the Western Front, where France had reason to want to attack Germany while it was weak, because Germany had taken Alsace-Lorraine, a contested region, away from France in 1870. France wanted it back. So if Germany sent all their forces to the Eastern Front, surely that would tempt France to attack them from the west. So Germany, once it was going to support Austria-Hungary in a war against Russia, almost had to go to war against France. Well, what about Great Britain? Well, part of it was that Great Britain had an alliance with France, but that wasn't the key point. The Germans, in order to fight France, had to go through Belgium. But the British had said, we offer a guarantee of Belgian neutrality, meaning that if any army, French or German, goes through Belgium, then the British will come to the aid of the Belgians. So since Germans' war plans required them to go through Belgium, then that meant automatically pulling Great Britain into the war. But frankly, had Germany showed signs of winning, Great Britain would have had to come in anyway, because the British strategic interest was a divided continent. The idea of Russia controlling all of continental Europe would have posed too big a threat to Great Britain. They needed the continent to remain divided. So, fascinating strategic how a small war between Serbia and Austria-Hungary expanded to include Russia, Germany, France, United Kingdom. Ottomans came in on the side of the Germans. The United States came in on the side of the Russian, French, and British forces, and became a world war. This shows how the perception that the offense had the advantage drove the shortcutting of diplomacy. It drove the creation of these chain-gang alliances, and it drove Germany's assumption that it could knock out France quickly before it would be able to shift its army to the east. But all of that was wrong. It wasn't a quick war. The defense had the advantage, and but the misperception led to a big war. That's called chain ganging. Now, The other misperception is if you think that the defense has the advantage when in fact it doesn't. Well, remember we said, how do countries tell whether offense or defense has the advantage? They look at the past war. Well, in the 1930s, countries looked at World War I and they said, that was a defense-dominant war. Surely the next war will be the same. But it turned out to be false. Germany under Hitler developed the concept of blitzkrieg, or lightning war. They learned how to use tanks which had introduced at the end of World War I, but the Germans used them to overrun entrenched defenders. And that allowed them to win quick victories against Poland, against France and Belgium, and to begin a campaign eventually against Russia. So it turned out that at least in the early stages, World War II was not a defensive struggle. It was an offense-dominant war. Now, what difference did that misperception make? Well, if you think that the defense has the advantage, then even though you might recognize that Germany has, aggressive designs, you might think, they might want to conquer Europe, but they'll never be able to do it because whatever country they attack will be able to hold them off via their defense. Moreover, it's not so important for Great Britain, for instance, to come to France's aid early on, or it's not so important for Great Britain and France to come to Russia's aid, or for the United States to come to the aid of Britain. Why? Because each country thought that whoever gets attacked first will be able to defend itself without help, so why should we get involved in trying to help them and get into a war we don't need to fight? Initially, the Russians felt the most threatened because Mein Kampf, Hitler's plan for conquest, had clearly stated that Germany had ambitions on territories to its east. Stalin tried to get Britain and France to form alliances to weaken Germany, but they were unwilling to do so. And so Germany was able to get away with taking parts of Czechoslovakia, with taking Austria, with rearming the Rhine, and nothing was done until finally when it attacked Poland. So in this case, the problem was that countries tried buck passing, trying to get the other countries to take the burden of confronting Hitler, and they did not form alliances quickly enough to actually take on Germany at a point when it might have been more vulnerable or too weak to defend against all of them at once. So what do we learn? We learned that offense-defense balance can impact the likelihood of war. When the offense has the advantage, war is more likely. Defense has the advantage, it's less likely. But what's also important is the perception, that misperceptions can also make for heightened danger of war. If the offense has the advantage, but you mistakenly believe the defense will have the advantage, then you will engage in buck passing, which means you'll be too slow to meet an aggressor, and it becomes much more difficult to deal with the aggression. On the other hand, if you misperceive and think that the offense will have the advantage, then you engage in chain ganging, which shuts short diplomacy and ensures that small wars expand to become big wars as all the great powers get pulled in. And then at the nuclear level, it all gets flipped, where the offense dominance gives rise to deterrence, and it's deterrence rather than defense that discourages war. So we've talked about realism in terms of how um, the anarchic structure of the international system makes cooperation difficult. It makes conflict. It makes it creates a self-help system where countries um, feel the need to arm themselves, which gives rise to a security dilemma where arming for defense makes others less secure and forces them to arm. We've talked about how, depending on the balance of power, if it's a multipolar system is more dangerous than a bipolar, which is more dangerous than a unipolar. On the other hand, um, in a power transition situation, if a unipolar system that is giving way to a bipolar system as a challenge arises, that's perhaps the most dangerous. And then we've seen how the offense defense balance affects warfare, including perceptions. So this gives us a pretty good overview of how realists think about world politics. It's very much through the perspective of great powers. It's very much through the perspective of military competition, through security. They have less to say about economics or about things like global warming or global issues or immigration. They have very little to say about smaller countries or developing countries. It's really a theory about great power competition. Now, our next set of lectures will focus on liberalism, which is the major competing alternative to realism. Thanks for your attention. Bye-bye.